I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's meeting of Camberley Chess Club online. Tonight we've got the pleasure of hosting Jim Stayt, who's a member of the Camberley Online Chess Club, but primarily represents Reading Chess Club and is captain, or is currently captain of one of their teams, and I believe has played for several different clubs over the years. And Jim's going to talk us through some of his most memorable and favourite games. So without further ado, over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Steve. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so the games have all been played over many years. There's some from nearly 30 years ago, where I vary between about 150 and 750 in playing strength. I'm not claiming the games with a particularly high standard. You're going to see plenty of mistakes by me and plenty of mistakes by my opponents, but they were all quite interesting to play. I'm hoping they're at least going to be reasonably interesting to watch. This first one is from in the days when I was playing congresses, and it was a tournament in Folkestone, which was a sort of 160 grading limit. And it was a 6-round tournament, and I was about the number 10 seed in the tournament at the time. And after the first 2 rounds, I'd noticed that all the people above me had managed to drop at least half a point. So I was there was nobody sort of stronger than me, level with me, if you see what I mean. So I was getting reasonably optimistic. And this is my round 3 game. I was 150. I was black against a 128. So I was sort of hoping to actually sort of move on to 3 out of 3. It has to be said, I'll make a bit of a mess of the opening.
You're black here, Jim.
I'm black here. So
Yeah.
we started with a French.
Who was your opponent?
My opponent was an A. Patterson, who was 128, who I'd never met before or since. So he got me out of the book quite early on. I mean, I met this sort of Queen G4 line about once before, but it's not the sort of main line. You'd expect to see white playing things like C3 and just shoring up D4 that kind of way, possibly something like Knight F3 or something. So this was already getting to the stage where I'd only seen it once before, and I don't play it particularly well. So start off by taking. Basically, although white doesn't recapture the pawn immediately, he can recapture it quite easily anytime he likes, really. So we got to this kind of position. I'm sort of putting a bit more pressure on E5. Okay, and I was now completely out of my book because we now deviated from the only time I'd sort of played this opening before. So I tried just sort of kind of developing sort of fairly logically. Okay. Trying to find somewhere sensible to put my knight. All looked fairly reasonable. Now, possibly after this, I get into a bit of trouble here, and maybe, well, I can't play H5 because he's then going to just capture on G6 and pick up a pawn. But this pawn advance proves a little bit embarrassing to my knight. So we castle. Let's just start. Okay. And this came as really quite an unpleasant shock. So it's immediately picking up a pawn. Okay, and it would have been quite good to have seen Knight G5 before he played it. He's obviously sort of threatening at the moment to win an exchange as well if I don't do anything. And it's safe to say I've basically made a little bit of a mess of this. So I drop back to deal with the threat to win the exchange, and he then sort of captures on H7. Now, I mean, I was nominally a pawn up because he's not recaptured on D4 yet. Okay, but he's now getting his pawn back, and it's quite a sort of irritating pawn. This next move is possibly not the best either.
Were you going to? Did you consider sacking the G pawn?
It's really
not in this way. I meant not in this way.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the way I played it, I was still trying to kind of play normally at this stage.
Yeah.
But things sort of get
Was Jim was knight f5 plausible instead of g6?
At which point?
When you play g6, could you
So
play
instead of
knight-
G6, you mean?
instead of g6? Can you play knight f5?
That was good.
Of course,
I
it
guess
makes a bit of a mess of your pawn structure,
probably.
but his knight might get a bit embarrassed there.
I guess at the very least he can take on f5 and either then take on it. Then if I recapture, then he's got things like either taking on f8 or just dropping the knight back to g5. So I don't think I'm able to actually trap the knight. Whether it would turn out to be better than what I did, I'm not sure. So I think if we're looking at kind of playing that, I mean, bishop takes f5 protects the knight. So I've got to take the bishop first of all. And then I guess, well, according to preference, he can perhaps either take on f8 or just drop the knight back. So I didn't really look at it, but the way the game went, it may well have been that it may be some of what I initially played. So anyway, we sort of played what we played. It went g6. He captured on f8. So I recaptured. And now he's got this pawn is going to be a bit of a nuisance, to be perfectly honest, because I can't easily get rid of it.
He's definitely putting the boot in.
He is putting the boot in.
Yeah.
And I was sort of kind of thinking I outgrade him by more than 20 points. I'm trying to actually win this, and it's looking, increasingly likely like I'm just being outplayed here.
Did you remind him of that during the game?
Not in so many words. I try to do it with my moves later on.
Oh, right.
But probably the best way.
You say, how dare you?
So I sort of thought I might try and just sort of blockade this pawn to stop things getting any worse. I mean, maybe I can get my knight back to back it and all this kind of thing. But in comes the bishop. I'm struggling. I now move my bishop to make room for the other rook to do something.
It's looking a bit grim, isn't it?
It is looking really grim. So round about here, I was thinking this is very, very, very passive. It wasn't looking like I got particularly good winning chances. It wasn't looking like I got particularly good drawing chances either. Okay, so we carried on for a little bit. I get my knight f5 in.
What was the point of queen f4?
I suppose, well,
I mean, wasn't knight a3 a bit more useful?
quite possibly.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, there may well be, yes, I think possibly just development or something like that. I mean, I suppose.
Well, you could play c3 and offer a gambit.
And put a rook on the c
Yeah,
file.
C3 is the move, isn't it?
C3 and put a rook on the c file. That might be quite embarrassing.
I think you could play
Yeah,
G4.
I mean, black is sort of white's clearly better here, so I'm sure there are good options for him.
I think you play G4 as prophylaxis against knight f5.
Yeah. Yeah. Gordon would like that.
I don't think Jim's claiming that he's better here or even equal, is he? So
Oh no, I mean I'm clearly worse here.
there's lots of moves White can make here to win, I should think.
Yeah.
Jim's would have shuddered.
So I was not liking. Oh, what's happened? No.
Oh, that's the way you dealt with it. You offered a draw.
Hang on.
Knocked all the pieces over.
You brushed all the pieces onto the floor and stormed out.
Right, hang on. Let's move a bit further through it. That might well have been my best move in the position. It has to be said. So I got to this sort of position. Okay. So queen f4, knight f5. Now he doesn't really want to leave that knight there. At the moment, it is sort of kind of threatening to take the pawn. I mean, I suppose he can drop the bishop back, but he took. So I took, and now he played g7.
Okay.
And my rook on h7 is not looking great, it has to be said.
But you've opened the G file.
I have opened the G file. So now he gets his knight out, and I was looking at this position and basically sort of feeling a bit sorry for myself. I mean, d4 is clearly going to drop because he's just going to put the knight on b3 or f3. He's going to put a rook on d1.
I'm more worried about that knight ending on d6.
Yeah, I mean, the position is basically rubbish.
Yeah.
So at this point, I thought, well, I've got to do something to actually sort of get back into the game because my rook on h7 is doing nothing. So I sacked the exchange, which at least gets rid of that bishop. I've got the half open g file. I've got, you know, at least I can now move something.
Yeah.
So okay, I've still nominally got the pawn on d4.
You've got rook g4 coming.
Rook g4 coming.
And queen h4.
So yeah. I've actually now got, I can now try and get a little bit of play. And having played absolute rubbish for the first part of the game, I now actually play a few coherent moves for a bit, which is quite nice.
He's forced you to do that. He's forced you to do that, Jim.
He has.
Yeah.
And I'm not normally a particularly attacking player. And what can happen is sometimes the way I end up is attacking is because my opponent forces me to by giving me a completely lost position. So I've just got to play for a finish. So anyway, yeah, we get rook g4 in,
Yeah,
which is obviously the sort of thing one might want to do.
yeah.
So okay, I'm now threatening to play f4, which looked like it might be a sort of sensible thing to play for. Okay, bring in some reinforcements. Now c3, although it might have been a good idea earlier, turns out to be a really bad idea in this sort of position. So he's probably missed the chance to play c3.
So did you go f4 here?
Well, I've now got bishop c6. And that bishop, which was absolutely shocking, players will know how shocking the white squared bishop is now turning out to be an absolute monster because it's unopposed on the long diagonal where he's played g3. And
you're going to play rook. You're going to play rook h4 any moment now.
Well, it's gone from being a piece which black is desperate to get rid of to a piece which is about to checkmate white. Not a bit.
That's my favourite theme in the French, Jim. That bishop coming into the game and winning.
Eventually,
Yes,
move 40.
Nearly often enough, unfortunately. So he now tries to get rid of my knight on my rook on g4.
Yes.
Okay, so let's let's open that diagonal up a bit more.
Why not?
And now I've got a little bit of a cheapo because now he can't take on g4 because he's getting mated on h1. Queen h1 is now mating. Okay, so he pins the old bishop, drop the rook back. I am now threatening. I've got threats of queen takes h2.
Yes.
By rook h6, followed by mate on h1.
Oh, lovely.
So he's got to kind of watch out for that. And suddenly it's starting to look like I've got a bit, from the position I had earlier, which was basically coaching resignable, it's getting quite interesting.
Could you just just put that combination on the board, Jim? Maybe play a3 or something like that as white. And just play a non-move as white.
I mean, if white just randomly played, for example, a3, then play queen h2 check. I mean, okay, he can wriggle out and play something like king f1.
King f1, yeah.
But if he were to end up taking,
Ka-ching.
Then we've got that as a sort of
nice.
And gold coins were showered.
Well, I wish he didn't allow it. Sadly.
That bishop's a great thing. I told you.
It's the old French bishop coming to life.
It is.
What's the problem, child bishop?
Yeah.
So at this point, after where have we got to? So he then plays knight f3, blocking up the diagonal. The other thing he had to watch out for, I suppose. I mean, there was something else he had. I was also just threatening much less exciting. I mean, I'm just threatening rook h6 here. So, and I mean that's just killing anyway, because of course if a rook moves, he's getting mated and he can't defend. If a knight moves, he's getting mated and he can't defend the knight. So that being a more prosaic way of just sort of finishing him off here. So instead he plays knight f3. Okay, well let's press on with f4 and smash him up a bit more. And now I can just take here and I can play queen g8, and he can't actually defend the pawn because his knight is pinned, so he can't move the knight so that the queen defends the pawn. So the G pawn is basically a gone. So I was now starting to think this was going reasonably well.
So has he got to sack the exchange on C6?
He now gives the exchange back. So we've now had me sacking the exchange and then him sacking the exchange.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm now in a position 3, 4, 5. I've got an extra pawn at the moment. You know, he can't sort of do things very easily. He can't take on d4, for example, because if I capture g3 is going, and I am actually now material up. So he now plays knight h4 so that he can protect g3. Okay, yeah. So I can now sort of just move my rook in. I am threatening here, of course, if he does nothing, I play rook takes h4 and take advantage of the fact that the g pawn's pinned. So he gets out of that. Okay. And I now start to gang up on e5. And I just kind of assumed, well, look, I'm going to be taking on e5. I'm then going to be 2 pawns up. His king's in a mess. I outgrade him by 20 odd points. You know, it's just going to be a win. I had a bit of a scare in the opening, but I'm now just clearly going to win.
Did he sack the exchange again?
Well, we will see. He does. He actually makes a bit of a fight of it, to be fair, and I give him a hand in making a fight of it. So having sort of now achieved a winning position, having been clearly worse, I now proceed to give him some counterplay. So obviously he's now threatening b5, which might be mildly irritating. So we get out of that. He plays it anyway. Now I can just sort of take the pawn, and I now just assume, well, I've done what I wanted in terms of taking a pawn. Now, if he takes on d4,
he has got the
C, for example, that he now is going to get into trouble with rook g3 check. Okay, and when the when the king moves, I've basically got a knight discovery to pick up the queen. So if he moves to h2. I mean, I've just got something like well, knight g4 is probably quite good, and then picking up the queen after that. So I was just kind of assuming this is just sort of this ought to be quite good, really. So I played knight e. So anyway, I played my knight e5, and also the other thing I thought he might try was queen c2, because queen c2 obviously is having a few threats down here, and I thought I could just handle that with rook takes g3, moves rook c3, and I'd thought, well, that's just sort of, so there's no problem down the c file because I've just got this sort of combo to just sort of block anything nasty down the c file. So I was kind of thinking I've got everything covered. You know, I'm a couple of pawns up, everything is going, you know, swimmingly. You know, it's all under control. Well, he then came up with a good move that I'd not seen, which was queen a3. And queen a3 has got well, queen d6 is a little bit irritating.
Yeah.
Because I'm then getting mated on c8.
Yeah.
So that was mildly annoying, really, because that was something I hadn't actually sort of prepared for. I prepared for queen takes d4. I prepared for queen c2. Queen a3 came as a bit of a blow. The time control, we're now on move 41. The time control, I think, was 48 moves in 2 hours, followed by a blitz. So at this point, I'm not, you know, we're also starting to get a bit short of time because it's not been a particularly easy game. So I've then got to deal with this sort of potential sort of bankment threat. So what I did then is I dropped the queen back so that now if he plays queen d6, then rook c8 isn't a problem because I've got the queen on it. He now played b6, which was irritating again. I played a6, which I think was probably rubbish. However, A takes b6 is not without problems either, because I can still get mated if I'm not careful, because his queen's covering the escape square. But I think probably taking with the taking.
You had to take it, didn't you? Mm.
Well, I mean, I think probably I should take, but you know, time scramble and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. What are you worried
So I
about?
played a6. The
Okay.
problem with a6, there's now all kinds of back rank mate threats at very inconvenient moments, and so I'm giving him sort of possible chances here. So he now plays rook c7. He's starting to get on my nerves, this bloke, to be perfectly honest.
How dare he?
Yeah, play queen c8. And now this is really, really crafty, because he's now threatening queen e6 check. If I take the queen, then he's then got rook e8 is mating.
Oh,
If I don't take the queen, then I'm getting into problems of, well, you know, my queen is hanging. And if I play something, I don't know, like king c8, then I'm sure rook c7 is probably winning, because then my king has to move away from defense of the queen.
You've got to go knight c6 here, haven't you?
So this was basically an irritation.
Yeah.
So what I ended up doing was playing rook g8, so that now I can take, because I've now reinforced the back rank. So I'm just about kind of holding things together, but he's being a bit of a nuisance, really. I mean, I suppose, to be fair, that's what he's trying to do. You know,
It is allowed in the rules of chess.
It is allowed in the rules. So he plays rook c7. We're getting closer and closer to the time control. Queen d5, throw in a subtle mating one and see if he notices.
Yeah, queen h1.
Always worth a try. King h2, we're getting really close to the time control now. Knight g4 check, king g1. You know, it's all starting to happen. Knight e3.
Spot the threat.
Yeah, well, the knight's on it at the moment, but rook g3.
Yeah, but rook g3 is
subtle threat here. Rook takes f7, and now my last move before the time control, so I play rook takes g3 check, which looks just kind of obvious. It looks obvious until you actually start to think about it. And I've now got problems, because I'm now in a position where he's just got a back rank mate threat. And playing rook g8 doesn't help, because it's still a back rank mate with rook f8 check. Because he's got the queen covering the rook.
Or queen f8.
So I'm now looking at this and then thinking, actually, it's a back rank mate threat. If I bring the queen back, rook f8 might not be checked, but it is pinning the queen to the king. And I suddenly think, oh, bother.
And bother, yeah. And your rook's hanging as well.
My rook's hanging.
So that's
I now realised, it now dawned on me, I've got to sacrifice the exchange, because we've only had exchange sacrifice each in the game.
Yeah.
So I've just got to play rook g2 check. Now he's really in a position where he's probably thinking he wants to take that. If he doesn't take it, I mean, I've certainly got things like rook g1 check.
So king e1, knight c2.
Yeah, unfortunately, John, that doesn't work, because after
back rank mate,
you've got the back
still
rank
back rank mate, yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, he grabbed the exchange, which isn't unreasonable, I suppose. So now I get to this position, and as we can all see, that lovely knight c2 check. But as soon as I win his queen, I'm getting rook f8.
You lose your king.
Which was it was getting increasingly irritating.
Did you complain to the arbiter?
Well, I was tempted to.
Yeah.
But what I end up doing is I check him about for a bit, so eventually I can actually pick up the rook.
Skewer the rook, yeah.
And now, at least, I'm not getting mated. Okay. What then happens is he starts a check. Now, obviously, I can't go in the corner, because then I'm being mated again.
Yeah.
So I have to come out to the corner. My queen is fortunately covering well, I mean, I intended it to cover c7, to be fair.
So queen c5 check?
Yeah, we get into all this kind of thing.
Oh dear.
And now, fortunately, I can bring the knight back so that I'm not losing the knight. But we get into this kind of sequence. Now, at this point, he is without checks. So he played this. We were into an Allegro finish, and at this point, I thought, well, the only sensible way to avoid the checks is let's just sacrifice a piece and work on the basis I'm just going to win the king and pawn ending. And this is basically where I stopped recording, and I just went on and basically, obviously, mopped up his pawn and queen and all that kind of stuff. But to be fair, he actually met. I mean, a combination of him playing some quite good moves and me playing some quite bad ones made it a lot closer than it should have been. Just to go on with that story, having won that and got to 3 out of 3, I got to the outright lead with 5 out of 5, a point clear of everybody else, and then contrived to lose my round 6 game and only ended up in a tie for first in the end. But it was, you know, one of very few sort of tournament victories I've had, even if I had to share it in the end.
What year was that?
Oh, we're going back to 1990, when I'm in my sort of university days.
Right. Okay.
So quite a while.
Who did you play for, Jim?
It was a tournament, wasn't it?
This was a tournament in Folkestone. At the time, I was playing for Oxford City.
Right.
So I was playing Oxford and District League for them. Prior to that, I'd been at sort of, well, Winnersh and Early and then Early. And
Right.
then eventually moved to Bracknell and then moved on to Reading. So I've done the tour of some of the local clubs over the years.
Did you ever play for lower Early?
I'm not sure if I can't remember them being lower Early. No. I mean, it was Early and Winnersh.
Did you ever play for a team?
Just early, wasn't it?
Well, it had a team of, it had Tony Coston and Sean Talbot.
Yeah.
I was certainly there. I mean, at that stage, I was a sort of teenager, and I was sort of playing in the sort of, you know, 3rd division or something. I was playing sort of for our C team at the time. But yeah, when needed to, I mean, we could do effectively what Sandhurst very often do now. We weren't actually paying the players, to my knowledge, but if we needed to win a game, you know, you could turn around with somebody like Tony Coston on board too, or something like that. And we did at the stage have about 3 people. We had people like John Saunders and Rowley Newton and Gerald.
Oh, really?
So
Oh, okay.
they were all around about 195, 200.
Yeah.
And we could put somebody like Bill Coles at his
Who?
peak.
Who was that?
Bill Coles in the days when he was playing in the sort of 180s and so on. We could have him on board 6 if we really needed to.
Oh, right. Okay.
But that was all, you know, I was down in the 3rd division at that stage, sort of struggling to get a grade. Okay, so that was quite an interesting one.
That was quite
That
a
was a game of 3 halves.
Yeah, that was a good game. Thank you.
Yeah.
I made, as I say, that I'm not claiming that any of these are perfect chess, but I think they're more interesting for being imperfect chess, to be honest.
Yeah. Definitely.
Okay, now my next one, I don't know if he's here today. But this next one is against Colin Line, if I've got the right game. And
he's on holiday at the moment.
He's busy scamming people at the moment.
Well, he isn't, but someone's pretending to be. Yeah. No, he's on holiday. Yeah.
I mean, over the years, Colin and I have played quite a lot of times. They've very often been draws. I think this is the only time I can remember beating him. And he's beaten me on a couple of occasions or so. And once again, this is a sort of situation where I was forced into going into ultra attacking mode by basically having a crap position, which is a sort of kind of common theme in, you know, if I'd just been left with a levelish position, it would have kind of petered out into another of our draws, which we've had a few of. Now, if Colin Purden's here, Colin did a session on the Winnower, and this is kind of tribute, I suppose. So I'm black again, and we went down a sort of we went basically down the sort of main line Winnower for quite a long way. So this is all just sort of very, very standard. One of the things I think Colin would be, I think we'd agree, Colin would be famous for is, Colin Line would be famous for is sort of knowing his opening theory.
Yes, he did.
Well, the first time I joined Camberley Chess Club in 2004, Colin learnt that I had some kind of computer, and he asked me to analyse some move in the winner, 23 Queen A3 or something ridiculous. And
that would get me sufficient. You don't have to know that much theory to get me out of my book.
and he said, I want to know what's happening in this position.
And the point is, the opponent's probably never going to get to that position because they're not going to know it. But
Well, I think to be fair, Colin did with people like Matthew Anderson. They had several struggles that went well on to move 20 plus into theory.
Okay.
And yeah.
Well, mine didn't last quite that long, but we're still sort of very much, this is all still very, very standard.
Yeah.
Okay, so we get to this, and this position here is basically where there are, there are several possible moves for white here. So it tends to white can play knight takes c3 and rook b1 are alternatives, and there are various minor alternatives as well. But queen c3 is one of the main moves.
Yeah.
Okay. And we got to this point, and I was now out of the book around this kind of position. So, the exact sort of thing as to what to do after h3, I wasn't quite sure. I might have been in the sort of standard queen takes c3 position, quite a lot. And I knew lots of general ideas and so on, but in terms of specifics, I was now kind of out of my book. I see Mark Taylor there. We've had a few battles in the winner over the years as well, haven't we? I should recall.
You're on mute, Mark.
So,
Yes, a lot. Yeah.
yes. So
Okay, that's enough. Don't overdo it. Just
yeah, it's good. It's good fun.
Yeah.
So knight f5. I mean, this is sort of thematic. Whether these moves are best in this particular position, I'm not sure, but they're kind of sensible things to play. So I went into h4. In some lines, it can be useful that there's a knight fork on f3. So if the queen gets tempted to d4, for example, in some lines, maybe if I push d4 and we exchange a few times, there can be some kind of knight f3 cheapo in there. And it's making it harder for white to develop the bishop and so on. Okay.
And it's holding up the kingside pawns as well.
Yes, yes. So it's not too badly placed there. We kind of got to this position, and I was, white is a pawn up. I was trying to look around for ideas because I think black's got to be quite active in this sort of position. If you let white sort of just consolidate, I mean, white does have a bishop pair and an extra pawn, and past h pawn, and you've got to try and play it reasonably actively. Sorry, what's happened there? Hang on, I'm taking back.
I think the king went to f2.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so I played d4, which again is a sort of thematic idea in this sort of position. Queen c4. That looks like it might be interesting. One of the ideas is at some stage to possibly just sort of sacrifice something on e5 and try and blow the center open. So I mean, sometimes black tries to play things like f6, but I mean, knight takes e5 and might be useful and get 2 pawns for a piece and have his king stuck in the center might be something I want to play for. So f6 again is all about just trying to open up the center. Now at this point, the engines never really understand the winner, and they tend to give black quite a sort of, they tend to think that white is just winning most of the time. And at this point, the engine just thinks, it had white at plus 2.7. But these positions are always very hard to play for both sides. So it's a sort of thing where, I mean, I play it with both sides, and I always find it hard, whichever side I'm playing it with, because it always seems to be quite double-edged.
Yeah.
Okay, so white takes the pawn. I mean, he's now got quite an impressive set of pawns there. Okay. Okay, and now what should happen? I mean, white should play c3 here. So c3 is the move. What that white actually did, yeah, instead of queen a4, let's go back. So instead of queen a4, what white should do is play c3, and I guess he's then going to be opening up the c file, which is potentially useful to put a rook on. He's stopping the d pawn is potentially a pawn in his sort of side there. And so that was from, and the computer thinks after c3 he's about plus 0.7. Sorry,
well, presumably bishop e3 follows as well.
Yes, and yes, so that would all be quite useful. What he actually allows me to play is d3, and this is when things start getting quite interesting. Now the point is that when he takes, and he's probably, he's probably really got to take that with something sooner or later. Otherwise, it's going to become a bit of a nuisance. But the point is now I've got rook d4, and rook d4 is forking the queen on a4 and the f4 pawn, albeit with a sort of, albeit with a sacrifice. So he then moves his queen to get out of the threat, and then I basically sack the exchange, try and get his king into the open a bit. Now, if he were to actually take the exchange, the problem he's then got is that his knight is going to fall on g3. So if we got into a position with, for example, bishop takes, queen takes, he's going to struggle to stop me taking that knight with check. I've probably got to take it with check because b7's hanging.
And you've got knight d4 check as well, maybe.
I've got things like knight d4 check coming. I've got, in some lines, the queen can be supported by the knight on f, for a queen f3 check at some stage in some lines. So he's going to have a few problems there. So he decided quite reasonably to not take the exchange.
Oh.
And just to drop his king back.
Ooh.
Because that way he's stopping my queen getting into the game in quite the same way. Okay. So, okay, but I have at least managed to expose his king a little bit. Now, I suppose things like rook takes f6 are not going to work here just because of bishop c3, which might be a bit irritating.
Maybe white's going to go knight e4, knight d6.
Yes, that looks.
Bearing in mind you're
totally
on b7.
Yes, that sounds like a vaguely sensible plan as well. So, well, let's get the knight into the game and have a bit of a check. Now, clearly here he can't go to the f file because then knight takes d2 is knight d2 takes d2 or knight d4 is a bit awkward. He can't go to e2 because of the knight d4. Okay. So we carry on, we take here. Now the engine at this point thinks it's dead level. It thinks it's just going to turn into a perpetual. Okay. So white at this point plays queen b2. No, sorry, I get knight d4 in. It's my move first. Then white plays his queen back. And then we get in a check.
Ooh.
And it's quite interesting here. He's got to watch out now with this check. The queen is, if I can ever get a situation where queen takes b7 isn't happening, if I can ever do it with check, I mean, I've got queen takes g3, I've got a queen coming into f4. There's various sort of things. I'm trying to engineer a position where I can play queen takes g3 check and therefore not have to worry about him getting counterplay on b7. Okay, so we go king e1. Well, I was in a sort of fairly sacrificial mood at this kind of stage anyway. I've been sort of sacrificing bits all game.
Is that the only alternative? I mean,
You've played king d1.
What's it after rook f2 check?
Yeah.
Possibly. It's a simple answer.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on here.
I mean, I suppose then, I mean, in terms of I suppose I'm a couple of pawns down. Is what's happening in terms of material. King d1. What's happening after king
that
d1?
is better.
So
I suppose he's looking at it and thinking he's attacking the rook this way, but there don't seem to be any obvious checks after king d1, so it may well turn out to be.
Can you do rook d8, planning knight c2?
Ah, yes. Yes, that might well be, but that's probably the way to carry on. So if we got into this sort of position, I suppose I've got some kind of enduring attack here. I mean, I am 2 pawns down, but I mean, I've certainly got sort of chances here. I think I've got some compensation for the material. So we got to, where do we get to? So we had rook f2 check, and then I captured on c2. Now he could, if he takes the rook, then I mean, I've got to, I suppose knight takes his check. He took, what he actually did is capture on d4.
Oh,
Which didn't seem too unreasonable in some ways. But what it does mean is that now he's no longer
queen d3 check.
He's no longer threatening b7, so we can do that.
Hoover off the knight.
Okay.
crowd went wild.
He is, of course, still material up, so he's still a pawn up in this position. And I mean, my king is not totally sort of safe. However, what I can now play is rook c7, and the point here is that I'm now threatening all kinds of things on the d file. So he's got the problem of the threat of rook d8, which just wins the bishop, because once the queen moves away, the bishop's sort of hanging. If the bishop
Jim, can you just put the rook back on c2 a sec?
yeah.
Yeah. So.
So yeah, what about queen g2?
So okay.
I mean, the rook.
So rook d8 then. What happens?
Sorry, the
after,
rook's hanging yet. Sorry.
what happens after rook d8 here?
Rook d8 here.
Get 2 rooks for the queen.
Yeah, I suppose that's an option, isn't it?
You've got to do that, haven't you? I think.
Oh, take it.
Why don't you just go off into lost ending there if you do that?
Well, let's have a look. Rook d8 then. Put it on the board.
So he's probably got to play queen takes rook check.
Yes.
Probably. Yeah. Okay. No king.
Well, taking with something. I suppose if he takes it this way, there's no queen f3 check.
King takes looks better.
Yes, that is half the point.
Yeah.
So what's he got? He's got, well, 2 rooks and a pawn for the queen.
I think
That's a lot.
this is
And there are lots of pass pawns as well.
And that bishop is not, the black bishop is not that healthy, is it?
This is quite an interesting ending, but I guess white's better.
It is after d5 though.
You know, g5, h4, blah blah blah.
No, you're right. Yes, d5 does liberate.
The black's queen's
I
quite.
think I prefer the game, to be honest.
Yeah.
Sorry, what does that mean? You think what? How would you assess this position?
I think this position is, well, I would rather be white here, and I think the move I played in the game worked better.
Well, those kingside pawns look very, very.
Yes.
promising.
I mean, I would be a bit concerned if I, as black here, as to, well, I mean, he may not get chance to, but if he stuck rook, if he was able to stick rooks on G1 and H1 without falling into a perpetual check or something, then he's just going to steamroll them, isn't it? So it's a case of whether I.
Yeah, no doubt of that.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough.
So what's actually happened instead in this position? I mean, I used a similar kind of idea. So going back to this position, I played rook c7, and the point is he's still stuffed on the d file because I'm threatening a rook to the d file, which is winning the bishop. If
Yeah.
he moves the bishop off the d file, then actually his queen is just going, because the rook is then just pinning the queen to the king. So basically, he's now going to have a few issues trying to actually deal. And of course, that rook has the added advantage. I mean, it is stopping any cheapos he's got on b7 and all that sort of thing, just as an added bonus. So he then plays king e2, which is then meaning the bishop is doubly defended, so that when I put rook on the d file, he's still got it covered. But let's put another rook in place.
Well, let's go rook d8 anyway.
Yes, I mean, so queen e4. Now I've got rook d5 is threatening rook e5, which is winning the queen. So he plays rook b5 to deal with that. Okay. Rook take d3.
There's loose rooks all over the place.
There are loose rooks all over the place.
It looks.
Okay,
John Lunn
and
might say something about that.
yes, loose rooks drop off, or words to that effect. So now I'm basically I've now basically won a piece, and his king is still in a little bit of a mess.
But the kingside pawns are not to be ignored. You know,
they're not to be ignored. However, he's got to avoid getting mated or dropping something important first.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, when I tried to put this in, the computer basically did a sort of kind of forced mate here. What I actually played was queen f1 check, which just wins the rook.
But what about rook c3 check?
Well, the computer came up with rook c3 check, which just sort of kind of, as soon as I tried to enter this, the computer said, I've seen a forced mate, and it just insisted on putting in the forced mate.
Well, let's put that in then. So rook c3.
Yeah, it will do. But I say I played queen f1, and because that was up the beef rook, Colin resigned at that point. Actually, if I do put in rook c3 check.
Okay, so king g2 or something.
So the
E2.
line that the computer found was king e2,
rook e3, king f2.
Yeah. So that would have been a neater finish, but me being a rook and a bishop up was sufficient for Colin to resign. So yeah. But again, that was unusually tactical for a game between Colin and myself, because they've tended to be very sort of stodgy, solid kind of affairs over the years. But I kind of got forced into a position where I thought, black's actually struggling unless he does something active. And once I got on a kind of conveyor belt of sacrificing things, I kind of had to carry on with the, sometimes you just get to the stage where once you've gone sacrificial, you've just got to kind of keep going sacrificial, Otherwise, it all just sort of falls apart.
Nice game, Jim.
Very good.
Yeah, it was.
That was a good game.
That was
Nicely explained as well.
entertaining. Well, okay, so since we've hit 9 o'clock, we traditionally have a comfort break for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So is that okay?
That's absolutely fine. That was kind of what I was planning on. So
right. Let's do that
excellent.
then.
Right. Cheers.
Just pause the recording. Okay.
Okay, so got a couple more games to have a look at. This first one was my best ever bit of calculation, although in the final position, it should have been a draw because I managed to then cook it up in typical fashion. This was a more, I've hidden the bits where I put in the dates, but this was in the Berkshire League, so it's a bit more recent, and it was played against Brian Millis, who at the time was around about 162, something like that.
From Bracknell.
And I'm white this time.
From ICL originally, John.
Was he?
Yeah, I've
Okay.
played him against, playing for Crowthorne against ICL. So.
So this
And you're
time
you're
I'm
white here, are you, Jim?
Yeah, just for a bit of variety.
Okay.
And we start off reasonably standardly. And I didn't know this line with bishop f5. It doesn't take very much to get me out of a book, to be honest. But one of the things I used to experiment with quite a bit in various lines of the c3 Sicilian was this move knight a3.
Yeah.
And this has got various advantages. I mean, it can get into b5, so that sometimes you can recapture on d4 with I mean, apart from the obvious threat to c7, sometimes you can then recapture on d4 with a piece if you want to avoid an isolated queen pawn. If black plays a6, then sometimes knight c4 can be a bit irritating for him.
Can you go c4 and d5? Is that an idea?
It could be. It generally supports a bishop on c4 in some lines, and it's just generally, it can also go back to c2 in lines as well.
Yeah.
Although possibly not with a bishop on f5. So it's a sort of a common-ish sort of sideline, which I see. So we take a knight b5. Now the engine at this point thinks should castle long. It's one of the few times, a lot of these games I've not really gone through with an engine because they were played, you know, I mean, some of the early ones were played when there weren't really these sort of engines around very much.
And then what, queen a4 or something?
Well, black plays queen d7, and I get a little bit of a sort of initiative in the opening here, which I sort of try and do something with. So we castle. Okay, and now we sort of put in a knight takes c6. And you know, black's in a position where he's not yet castled. He's got a problem with a pawn on the pawn's currently hanging, and you know, I've got a little bit of play here. Not sure if it should necessarily amount to very much. I am now threatening the subtle bishop b5.
Yeah.
So black needs to do something about that, and given that he's also trying to defend his e-pawn, he may play the quite sensible queen c7. Okay, so we get in a bishop b5 check. Okay, and now knight g5. Subtlety was not really a thing at that point, you can see. And so
there were no cheapos with knight e5 running. No. No.
The problem I suppose I've got is I haven't developed my bishop. If I was in a position to answer it with rook e1, that would be good. But I'm not. But one thing I haven't sort of done anything with is my dark squared bishop. So I now had a bit of a long sort of think, and came up with what is still the best ever combination I've sort of had in terms of accuracy of bean counting, as it were. And I found, I realized I could force an ending a pawn up. Now, whether I should be playing for more than forcing an ending a pawn up, I don't know. But I was sort of thinking, here I am playing a decent 160 player, and I calculated I could now just get into an ending, a solid pawn up, and thought, well, you know, that can't be a bad thing. So whether it was the right thing to be aiming for, I don't know. I mean, a better player might turn around and say, well, actually, you could have played this with a really strong attack. But I ended up.
Have you got knight e6 here, Jim?
Well, this is what I've got, and And knight e6 turns out to be really quite strong. Now, obviously, it's fork king, queen, and rook, so it's got to be taken basically.
Yeah.
Himself would have overlooked that.
So we now bishop e7 is forced.
So bishop g5.
Yep.
With rook d1.
Queen
to follow.
d6. Now his only moves are queen d6 and queen c5.
Yeah.
So he's got to defend the bishop, and those are the only ways he can do it. I can't remember what I was doing after queen c5, but I mean it could easily work out similar. So I take off the queens, and I now get the exchange here, and now I could take advantage of the fact that he's got lots of pieces of d file.
Rook d1.
Yeah. So now, if he moves the bishop, obviously, then I'm playing rook takes d7. So he has to defend the bishop with the king. But now I can give up the exchange again and play rook d1. And now I'm basically picking up. I've got to take with the.
And you've got bishop g4, so there's no problem. Yeah.
Well, b4 is the move I should play.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this was a situation where I just kept each time I calculated that my next bit of the combination worked, and it was, I mean, as I say, it's the best combination I played in.
Hang on, in this position, you should play b4. Did you say? Am I going there?
Improvements along the line. b4 is an improvement because it basically means Black's king has to retreat. And later on, that turns out to be
I thought you
important.
meant here. No, you mean before all the fireworks kicked off.
No. Well, b4 is now an intermediate move that I should play.
Well, because of it's the king. Hang on. So let's put this on the board then. So
Well,
b4, king b5, rook d5 check.
No, I think you play something like.
Sorry, I think b4. I think b4 is actually in a later. It's in a later position.
Thank you. That's what I was trying to say.
It's in a later position. Sorry. So I played bishop d7.
Yeah,
and he played rook d8, and now I should play b4.
rather than bishop g4.
It's a slight difference. Yes.
It is a slight difference in that it doesn't hang a piece.
No.
Yeah, b4 now would be good. But what I had seen is I could play bishop g4, and I wasn't getting any trouble with the pin. And I'd seen that I was basically a pawn in this thing, and that Black has got an isolated e pawn. And I'd seen all this when I played knight e6, which is, for me, that's an unusually good combination. It had taken a little bit of effort, time to actually do it, as it were. But I just thought, well, we better play. I'm a pawn up in an ending. But I should have looked for an intermediate move, and just going back a little bit. In this position, if I play b4, it basically forces his king back, and that turns out to be really important later on. But I suppose I'd used up quite a bit of time. I was trying to catch up playing these moves to be quickly.
Yeah, but of course he can't go king c4. Yeah.
He's got to watch out for not being on a light square, because
exactly.
Discovery picks up the rook.
So
he would have to go king b6.
Yeah.
Because king c4,
bishop e6
king
check.
c4, bishop e6 check, and rook takes rook.
Yeah.
And this is why it would. But I wasn't really looking for improvements. I just played the combination of my life, as it were, and realised that I was a pawn up in an ending, and feeling a bit cocky and sort of proud of myself, having played all this and thinking I'm a pawn up, and also one eye on the clock, and I'd used time actually finding knight e6 in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this should still just be winning, but I managed to make a little bit of a mess of it in typical Stayt fashion. And the problem is that Black's king is active, which proves to be a bit of a nuisance. Now, at this stage, the engine still has me at plus 0.93, so basically a pawn up, but I didn't play this next bit well.
So if bishop e2, bishop d3 then?
Bishop e2.
Well, bishop e2 is the move.
Yeah, and then bishop
because I've got to
d3.
stop his king.
I'm a
If he
bit
then
nervous.
plays bishop d3, I think I just move my king across and defend the bishop.
Yeah, you can't
And
take it. I don't
basically
think.
No.
I'm picking his king entering, basically.
Yeah.
The way I play it, I basically let him get too active.
Okay.
So he's now getting his king right in amongst all my bits.
Mm.
And suddenly my pawn up ending isn't such an obvious pawn up, just sort of winning ending, because I just don't play it very well.
Yeah, you won't.
So I've got all this sort of kind of, this is a little bit of a nuisance.
Yeah. Was there?
Yes,
Yes, it is.
So bishop f3. B.
I've got to avoid him getting his king into c2.
Yeah, you can't allow that.
Because if I let him get the king into c2, then he's picking up either b2 or c3.
He's
He
winning.
might even be winning then.
Yeah. Oh, yes, I think he is.
Keep the bishop on the D1 A4 diagonal.
So I was just starting to get a bit worried and think, have I really forced my opponent into a winning position here? Yeah, which is always a little bit galling, given that he hadn't seen knight e6 or anything as we discussed after the game, and it would be a bit irritating to play the combination of my life and force my opponent into a winning position. So I played bishop a4. Obviously, I've got to stay on this diagonal. I can't go to b3 because his bishop's it. I'm trying to possibly get my king over to try and prevent him playing king c2 with a king.
So b5 check. b5 now.
Maybe.
What happens after that?
He didn't.
What happens after b5 then, Jim?
Right, so, well, I mean, I suppose I've got the option. If taking it proves awful, I've got the option of going back to d1. Although I can't see winning after that. I'm probably not losing after that.
Well, bishop d1 a5.
Yeah, fiddle about with pawns on the king side, I suppose. I've got to be a bit
You
careful.
might end up getting zugged here, actually.
Doesn't matter if you. I mean, if you take on b5 and the king comes into c2 and takes on b2.
c4.
I'm just playing c4 and c5 here.
Yes. Yes. So that's probably the way.
Basics, you know.
So what we're sort of kind of suggesting is this.
Yeah. And then
that should be all right because the pawn's going to get to at least c6, I think.
Yeah. He plays c5, bishop d7, and
he can't pick up the a pawn because I could stick the a pawn on a4.
Yeah.
If he plays a6, he's sacrificed all his queenside pawns. So that's probably. I think I'm at least holding that then.
I think I should be winning that, Jim.
Yeah, I think c5, bishop d7. I think you're much better.
Yeah, but you don't do that. You play a4, then you get your king out.
Gotcha. Yeah.
You don't play c5 until you have to or want to get your king out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if king takes b2, I can play a4, and at some stage I'm going king d2 and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, because he hasn't got time to keep. If he moves his bishop away, then you do run the pawn.
So basically, what we're saying is that b5 doesn't work. It's a nice try, but doesn't work. But going back to this kind of position, I've got issues here because.
Okay, I'm going to say a6. What about a6 and b5? Yeah, what about a6 and b5, Jim?
Maybe. I suppose I can try playing king d1 to answer b5 with bishop c2 check or something.
Right.
I mean, whether I'm winning or not is debatable, but I mean, I think I can try and move the king over, and then I've always got c2 as a square for the bishop.
Yeah.
If you allow black to play bishop h5 check, you're forcing another pawn onto a white square, which might prove problematical later.
Yes, I suppose bishop h. Yes, if we got to bishop h5 and I played f3 and he played e4. Yeah.
You could play g4 there. I mean, it's not great, but I don't know what's going on there.
But it's certainly not the solid pawn up that I'd pawn up win my sleep kind of thing that I'd envisaged.
The king is
the thing is, the king is supercharged, isn't it? The black
Yes.
king. It's
And that's why I needed to have got that b4 in as an intermediate move, force it back to b6, and that would have given me the time to get my king somewhere like d2 and just sort of be clearly better.
that would
But
be enough.
having seen that combination, I was so keen to just play it and rest on my laurels and think of how smart I was, and I didn't actually possibly sort of look at improvements to it, and perhaps not evaluate the position. So I counted the bits in the final position, but I didn't really judge some of the issues that there were in that. I mean, I'd counted that I was pawn up. I'd counted that black had got an isolated e-pawn, but what I hadn't done is realised how difficult that might be to win, especially if I left black with his king there.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is the story of one's life as a sort of as an amateur player, but it very rarely all comes together. I think that you sort of. So going back to this position, having played bishop a4, my opponent didn't do any of those things, but he did go bishop d5. Now, if I go g3, I suppose he might perch his bishop on f3, possibly. If I leave, obviously, if I leave the pawn there, it's going to be a bit of a nuisance. His bishop's just on a really nice active square there.
Every pawn will be on a black square, so it's
And you have king d1 and bishop c2 check here.
Skewering the H pawn. Yeah.
So I played f3.
yeah.
E4 looks fairly obvious. Get rid of that dodgy pawn. And I've got to sort of take that off, I should think, or do something about it, because otherwise it might actually become quite dangerous. I don't know why I decided that was better than g3. I suppose I had my reasons.
Well,
What's a? I suppose if I play g3, what's happening then? I suppose, I mean, bishop f3 is just a bit of a nuisance potentially, because it stops my king ever getting over to the king side, although king f2 over to the queen side.
Jim, did you toy with the idea of just offering a draw? I mean, it's just saying I'm fed up with this. How was your morale? That's what I'm asking.
Well, it's a pawn up, so why should they?
Yeah, I didn't quite at this
really
stage, although I could see it was the way it was going a little bit. And I got very, very lucky. So I played c4, and my opponent played bishop c2, thinking that bishop was a bit of a nuisance. Whoops. And of course, he's just overlooked this, and now he can't stop the c pawn. So after all that, I got quite a lucky win. I think probably my earlier play with the combination, I sort of felt it was kind of I'd earned the win with that combination almost, but I nearly managed to make a hash of it in typical Stayt fashion. But as I say, I just got in the end position, because I think black should probably have been able to hold that final position if he plays sensible things in this kind of position. I mean, I don't really see where I'm going, because I can't believe those. I mean, if I try and ever play something like b4, then the king gets into squares like c3 and maybe b2. And as long as he's got the bishop to stop the pawn getting too far, I mean, he can just take the pawn. I've got to play if I wanted to move any further. So I don't see why black should just be able to hold that, I think.
Oh, yes.
Black can just push the H. Black can just push the H and the G pawns, can't they, at the board?
Yeah, I mean, I think objectively now it should just be a draw. I think I should be able to hold it. I think. Okay. If the king goes into c1, then he allows things like b4.
Yeah.
And I can probably exchange off enough pawns, but in the end, as I say, I just got very lucky with a sort of my opponent blundering, which was a bit of a relief.
I bet it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, basically. but it remains the best bit of calculation I ever did, even if it ended up in a position that I nearly drew. So there we are.
Certainly the deepest calculation.
What was so sorry, Jim? I missed the blunder. Can you just?
They knew more.
Yeah. So what's actually happened is he traded off my bishop, and the point is there after b4, he just can't stop the c.
You got c5. Yeah.
I've got c5, and he just can't stop it.
Did you resign there?
He resigned at that point.
Yeah.
But
phew, that was close.
It was close. It was closer than it should have been. Okay. For the final game,
Jim?
This was from my days at Oxford City, and it was against somebody I played quite a lot. It's against Nick Jakubowicz, who was a very strong junior at the time. So I was in my student days. He was about 4 or 5 years younger. I saw him the other weekend. Actually, he doesn't play chess anymore. But he got to the stage round about the time he was retiring of the late 2200s sort of thing. He just turned over about 3 IMs in about a couple of weeks, and decided at that point after that he didn't really play very much. But we ended up sort of playing in quite a lot of situations, because at one stage he was playing for Oxford City A, I was playing for Oxford City B. We ended up playing in club tournaments, and we ended up with a 2-legged game in the semi-final of the county championship in the days when I was playing in Oxfordshire. And altogether we played about 30 competitive games. I didn't ever beat him, although I did get quite a lot of draws. And the background to this one is that it was the last round of the club championship at Oxford City, and he was ahead, and I basically needed to beat him to tie for first place. And the problem is we knew each other's game inside out, because we played as teammates, we played regularly sort of club, we played blitz against each other. We both knew each other's repertoire inside out. So I thought I'd got to try and do something different. And he would traditionally play the Schliemann variation, the sort of early F5 variation against the Lopez. He knew that far better than I did and was far more familiar with the sort of positions. So I basically thought I'd just got to do something different. So what we ended up doing is I wanted to get my surprise in before he could get his sort of Schliemann in. So I got to get my surprise in early, basically. Wow. So this might look fairly boring.
So you went back to the 19th century.
I went back to the 19th century. I played the Belgrade Gambit. Now, there are lines here where black grabs the second pawn on e4, and it gets quite hairy on the e file, and there's some quite complicated lines in that. There are also lines where black takes on d5. He can try things like getting a bishop b4 check in. He can try various things in terms of so there's various ways of declining the sort of gambit. Takes the knight play, bishop b4 or knight b4, and there's a whole range of different sort of variations in this. But I was gambling on Nick not knowing it very well, and Nick didn't know it very well, so the gamble kind of paid off. But he played a perfectly sensible looking move and just sort of tried to sort of defend the pawn, which seems thoroughly reasonable. It's not one of about 7 or 8 moves it suggests in all the literature. Okay, well, that just kind of looks tempting. Okay. Of course, black's not yet committed to castling kingside, so I don't necessarily want to open up the file yet. Okay, well, you can't have too many pins. So a few more pins. So this was, so we were both totally out of book, pins left, right, and centre. My e-pawn is weak. He's got issues on f6. He is briefly a pawn up. So this was quite interesting. I'd at least got him into a stage where he didn't know what was going on either. and he was, he's in a position where he's playing somebody who's rated a bit less. He needs to get a result out of the game, and he was starting to look a bit nervy, and he was also a bit of a time trouble addict, and he was starting to have to sort of use time to try and work out what was going on. And in fact, he got into quite severe time trouble later in the game. Okay, so we get in an H3.
Excuse me, Jim.
D4.
Do you have to win this game then, or
I have to win this game.
Okay.
Yeah. I've never beaten him before in a slow play game in my life, and he's a higher rated player, and he was a higher rated player than me when he was about 14, and I was a student at uni. So he's a pretty decent player in those days, and quite a good sort of prospect. So he's now putting even more pressure against E4. Okay, well, let's put a bit of
Maybe the gambit's gone wrong. Maybe is that too harsh?
Well, it's all a bit
iffy.
I don't know. I mean, it's a crazy kind of position.
Well, maybe you're happy. Yeah, as with the preceding one, what I said was with such a hyperactive king, I just wondered how your morale was, as opposed to what moves you were going to play. So in this position, you're probably quite excited because it's very early on, and you're feeling fresh and looking forward to a good game.
Yes, I mean, it looked like it wasn't going to be one of our boring draws.
Not quite yet, no.
Not yet, anyway.
No. Okay.
So, well, and we're safely out of the book anyway. Okay, so he now castled.
Ooh.
Which is, but he's got no going back. He's got no sensible way of defending C6 because, of course, his bishop can't get back there. He could play bishop takes D4.
Well, that just helps mine.
It helps it gets my queen out. It puts more pressure on F6. And getting his king out of the centre is probably not a bad idea. But of course, it does make F6 look a little bit more vulnerable. One of the issues I've got, of course, is that my king is still on the E file. Bishop takes E4 is coming at some stage. So if I'm a bit careless on F6,
oh yes,
my knight on D4 is currently hanging. So it's a little bit unclear. I quite liked it. I mean, at this stage, I mean, going back in terms of having looked at it subsequently with an engine, at this stage, I was plus 0.81 allegedly, so it quite liked my position. Now,
have you got knight F5 here
then? I didn't consider knight F5.
Yeah,
maybe I should have considered it. I was more interested in things on C6. Now, the engine did not like castles, although at the time we both thought it was a reasonable move.
for black.
Yeah, I can't remember what it suggested as an alternative, but it really wasn't particularly impressed with castles. I suppose it's looking at the fact that the kingside pawn structure might get demolished any time soon. So right now I've got the choice as to, well, what to actually take with here. So I'm going to capture on C6. I took with a bishop.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
And I quite liked having, I thought these knights were going to be a bit of a nuisance for him. So I'm now got to the stage where what's happening, I'm now a pawn up. I have got problems on E4, especially after this move. So he's now getting out of the pin. If I try and capture on F6, I mean, if I take with a knight, then he's going to recapture, and after bishop takes, he's taking on E4. And I think if I take with a bishop, he's probably
the knight's hanging on C6
anyway.
Got 97.
Yes, it is.
It's got 97 check.
Yeah.
Knight E7. Knight D.
Maybe I should be throwing in a knight e7. I played knight d e7.
Yeah.
Whether that's the right knight to put in e7, I'm not sure.
Jim, very quickly, sorry to butt in, but could you play bishop f6 followed by f3 and just try and sort of shut out the white square, black's
Bishop
white square
6,
bishop?
I think he's going to take on e4.
Oh, yeah, so we've got that's an intermezzo. Yeah, sorry, okay.
On the rook on h1.
And the rook is hanging, so bishop takes, so I've got to then probably moving my king somewhere.
Yeah.
And if the king goes to d2, then he can then take on d5.
So I missed that, but could you instead play f3 here?
No, the knight's hanging.
But not. The
knight e7 check. No, it's not.
The knight on c6 isn't hanging, and if black plays knight takes d5, you play queen takes d5.
Yeah.
I mean that might well be a thing.
Yes, it is. I think.
Can I just mention knight c, e7 check, king h8, and then you've got knight takes f6, pawn takes, bishop takes. Is that checkmate?
Sorry, run that by me again.
So knight c, e7 check.
Yes.
King h8.
Yes.
No, sorry.
Knight
takes. Yeah,
takes,
he's not going to. Knight takes knight. He's not going to go pawn takes knight, is he? But anyway,
Queen takes knight.
Queen takes knight. Yeah.
That's a brave try, though. Thank you for that.
A little checkmate if he plays along. Sorry about that.
Come on, let's not.
So after queen e8, what I actually did is I played this other knight in there. I can't remember why. I suppose it might have been to do with the fact that knight was hanging in some lines. Although I've no longer got this sort of knight fork, I am still doubling pawns round his king. And at that point, black is threatening a couple of things. He's threatening d5. The significance of him playing d5 is then that the bishop is hitting e7.
Oh, you play queen d5.
He's also threatening bishop takes e4. So I've got to deal with the twin threats of d5 and bishop takes e4. And a very strong player at the club who was spectating and has sort of kind of seen all this several moves ahead, thought that black was just winning at the point because I couldn't deal with both bishop e4 and d5.
Queen f3 threatening me.
Yeah, three's quite good.
Well, what I actually got is queen f3, and queen f3 is relatively strong. I mean, it is threatening mate in one. So it does kind of force black's hand a little bit, and it basically forces king g7. And what that gave me then chance to do was to castle queenside and get my king off the e-file. So looking at this, I was quite happy with this. I was still a pawn up. My knights are, well, you know, if one of the knights moves, the other knight is hanging. So there's a little bit of an issue there.
Could you have played h4 instead of castling? Not possibly. H4 is something I play very, very soon anyway. I wonder what happens after d5. H5. Pawn takes pawn.
Okay, so we're
Pawn
going
takes
h4.
So h4, d5, h5,
Bishop e4.
bishop.
Oh, you can't
Bishop
allow that.
e4, h6 check.
Well, hang on, sorry. So in this position, we're going.
I'm going h.
Yeah, I see where we're going with this.
H5, bishop takes e4.
Yeah. Yeah, go on then.
Resigns.
Yeah. No, but h6 check and mate. Yeah.
h6.
Oh, I see. With the idea of mate on f6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
h6 check.
Okay. In that, yes, that
it's going to be mate, isn't it? Because you can't come forward to g6 because the knight's
okay. But there's an alternative plan. which is bishop
It's
takes.
gonna need to be.
Okay, so leave the bishop there
Ah,
and play that in.
Hey?
okay, h6 check.
Well, H
But
takes
now
G-
f6
Oh
is
no, he can go king
H
h6.
takes G6. I would have thought. But I
Uh,
don't know where that's going. Nowhere, probably.
f6 is just
Oh, yeah.
solidly defended.
yeah,
So
yeah.
G8 square's vacant now. That's gone.
Creative try.
very creative try.
Yes, yes.
You probably have to take on E7.
Well, I like to avoid castling wherever possible, which poor Sloan always tells me off for.
Trouble is, you've got to get the king off the E file, haven't you?
Castling's for wimps.
Yeah. No, I think there's probably all sorts of possibilities that neither of us saw, because it was quite a sort of full-on game. The best bits of this game are actually in some of the variations that didn't get played, which I'll show you later on. So going back to this position when I wimped out and castled. Okay.
I don't think that's wimping out. I mean,
I thought
bring another
it was
piece into
sensible.
play, yeah.
Now at this stage, Nick can now got 7 minutes to play his next 14 moves. And this is not a trivial position to be playing 2 moves a minute. And it's kind of tribute to the fact that he's a pretty decent player, that he managed to get out of this. And I was still thinking, well, hang on, I'm a pawn up, my king's safe. I thought my king was safer than his king was. I've got to be a little bit careful that one of the knights doesn't drop off if I move the other knight and so on. I've got ideas like h4 and all that kind of thing to come. But I was thinking this was reasonably encouraging here.
Yeah.
So I then play h4 because we've all been clamoring for that all the time. And now he plays queen 6. And the point of this, I mean, it has a couple of threats. It's got things like queen takes a2, but it also means now if I play h5, he's now playing bishop takes e4, because he's kind of made room. He's now hitting e4 again.
yeah, that was the house, isn't it?
Yeah, but what he has done by moving a queen there is he's now not hitting the knight on c6. And that basically means my knight can go into f5 check. Now, he doesn't really want to be taking that because he's going to be opening the H file, the G file, sorry, and that might sort of prove to be a bit of a problem. So he, not unreasonably, decides to tuck his king away in the corner. And I played a sort of wimpy move here. I thought, well, I'm not going to just allow queen takes a2. I'm going to play king b1. Well, a5. And at this point, the engine just thinks I'm winning. I mean, it's just got me as equivalent to about a piece up or something. It didn't really feel like I was winning quite as comfortably as that, although I did think I got quite a reasonable position. But Nick being Nick made life a bit tricky for me. So I bring in the other knight. Not quite, I suppose that could conceivably be, I'm trying to remember why I played that. It could conceivably be going to d5, I guess.
I think you've also got the possibilities of g5 and queen c3. I think.
Yes, that looks vaguely reasonable. It looks like a reasonable move to play anyway. It looks like it's got sort of potential. Okay, so he's now threatening, I suppose, to give up the rook for 2 knights. So I've got to keep an eye on that. But if he does that at the moment, if he plays rook takes at the moment, he's going to get into a situation where his bishop gets trapped. So after rook takes knight, knight takes rook, queen takes, he's getting into problems with h5 now that I've put an extra rook on to e1. Okay, so just keep hacking. And now he's starting to get a few ideas, because now he's got sort of things like bishop a3. Well, the queen's on it at the moment, but he's got sort of things happening, you know, in his own right here. And bear in mind, he's playing at 2 minutes a move, so he's sort of having to blitz away a little bit. Okay, I'm just getting out of any sort of pins there. And now he's going to sort of double rooks on the b file. So he's making a bit of a fight of this, to be fair to him, but then that's what sort of 180 junior type players do. Okay, so I'm now...
Jim, sorry to butt in, but can he play rook b2 here?
I'm not sure he can straight well. In this position rather than f4.
Yeah, I mean, in this position, instead of rook b6, can he play rook b2?
What's happening? I suppose at the moment my queen's defending a3, which might be relevant, and the queen is also defending c3 if he tries to put something on the diagonal.
Yeah,
it is a recurring idea, and rook takes b2 becomes, you know, as you'll see in some of the notes later on, rook b2 is sort of quite a relevant thing. So I've now got a little threat of my own. I'm going to try and sneak into h6 and mate him if I can. Okay. Well, I did warn you. So now what he does is he gives up bishop for knight. Now he's not really got a lot of alternatives here. I mean, if he, well, got no alternatives whatsoever. If he plays rook g8, obviously I'm just taking it and I'm doing the same kind of thing anyway. So he's kind of forced to this. Now, there are lots of variations here. This is where the game basically peters out. Because after knight takes f5, I've got my sort of mate threat. But in the end, we just got to a situation where I played g5. It would be quite good if he let me just take on f6 and have a pawn on f6.
So rook g.
But actually, what he did, so I don't want that one yet. I want right. Hang on, I need to just take back because there's one of the notes.
It's tantamount to a draw.
No, sorry, no, we can't. We go on a little bit further. So after g5, he then plays bishop a3. Okay. Which has got threat. And now if I were to take on a3, he's then got queen e5, which is mating me.
Oh, yes.
Which is the sort of subtle thing.
Typical shabby Nazi trick. Yes.
Yeah. I played rook b1.
Ooh.
And now he played rook g6, and I then have to basically bail out with a draw. So what basically then happened is I can force a repetition. But I've got no improvement on forcing that repetition, and we just sort of took a draw. What was sort of interesting was some of the things in the notes afterwards. So if we go back to this position where I recaptured with a knight, okay. So I've just come from here. I've recaptured with a knight to threaten mate. There was an alternative, which was e takes f5, and e takes f5 appears to be very, very strong here, because if the queen moves away, then queen takes f6 is mate. So if he plays something, for example, like queen d7. Yes. Then queen takes f6 is mate. So superficially, e takes f5 looks like a really strong move. It looks like black's just losing his queen, because the queen can't defend f6 without staying on the e file where I'm just taking it. However, black can ignore it and play rook takes b2. and rook takes b2 is mildly irritating. Now, if we get into now, there's another line which almost but not quite works. So before we go back to rook b2, before we go to rook b2, queen a2.
This is what I've been itching to play.
Yes, well, queen a2 actually is quite interesting.
Here's if it works.
Yeah, bishop d4.
Yes, and then bishop d4. Okay, now here I've got problems because it's very difficult to stop rook b1 double check followed by rook b2 mate. And the bishop on d4 is rather irritatingly defending against f6. Queen a2 is quite interesting. I can get out of it.
You got knight g6 check.
I've got knight g6 check.
Yeah.
So what?
And now, if he wants to, I mean, he can king g8 to repetition because I just go back into e7.
No, just take it.
If he takes it, then that doesn't work either. Because what I have got is rook e8 check, which forces, he's now got to move the rook away. And now I've got pawn takes pawn. And now I'm threatening mate on h7. And now he can't actually defend h7. If he plays something like rook e7, then he's getting mated by queen f8.
Yeah, you've got the draw with rook b3 check.
He's got a draw, but with a discovered check with a rook. So he's then forced into taking the perpetual. But he's got no way of covering h7, so he can't do for more than the draw.
How ironic, because we thought you were going to do that, and now he's done it.
Yeah, and this is one of the lines we discovered after the game. So we had quite a good analysis session after the game between the two players and the strongest player at club at the time. So that was one really quite fancy variation. It's not the only fancy variation.
No, but it's not.
So going back to this position, when he just played rook b2, right, there is another possibility. Rook b2, I can then take his queen, and he can play bishop d4, which is threatening all the same kind of stuff again. So he's still threatening rook b1 double check followed by rook on 8 to b2 mate. However, this time I've got a way out of it by playing queen e7 check.
Oh wow!
I've got, now the pawn isn't on f5. I've got knight f5.
Oh wow!
And at the end of the sequence, I mean, put his king somewhere. I take his bishop on d4, on a piece up, and he's no longer got his mate because I've got everything covered, and I'm just going to be, well, I mean, in terms of pawns, I'm going to have he's going to have what, 6, and I'm going to have a piece for less than 3 pawns kind of thing, and I'm probably going to be winning. So that was quite an interesting variation that we discovered as well. So it was a game in the end where all the really good variations were kind of in the sort of all the good variations were ones that didn't actually occur over the board, but they kind of occurred in all the sort of analysis afterwards. Altogether, we had a queen sack for him, a queen sack for me, and a knight and rook sack for me, which could have happened. And those have all been computer checks and are objectively sound as well. So they are actually the best moves in the position. So I had to be content with a draw, and that got me something like joint second or something along those lines in the tournament. And the right player Nick won the tournament when being the strongest player in it, which seemed reasonable. But it was, I never actually managed to beat him in a proper game. beaten him in blitz, but never in a proper game. But that was probably the closest I got, and it's quite an interesting one, I think. Isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Superb game.
Yeah, very good.
Enjoyable.
Yeah, it's very fascinating.
Have you any idea why he gave up?
I think he got to a stage where he was sort of university kind of. He just got to the stage where he was doing things like sort of PhD and all that kind of stuff, and just
Yeah.
concentrating on work, concentrating on family, and that kind of stuff.
Yes.
And I suppose you get to the stage as well where you realise you're not necessarily going to, you know, you're good, but you're not going to be a GM or whatever.
Mm.
And you know, the amount of work, I think also the amount of work he was having to put in to stay at that kind of level, and to, you know, prepare for his opponents at that kind of level. I think he just found it all a bit too much, and he got better things to do with his life, sort of thing. But
yeah.
But still a decent player. I mean, I played him, you know, about 4 or 5 years ago in a sort of blitz sort of session when I was playing regularly in the league, and he played for about 10, 15 years, and he absolutely took me to pieces. And he just beat me about 10-1 or something like that in blitz, despite having not played for 15 years or whatever. Yeah. So, anyway, that's basically. I've got the games, but I've shown you the best ones basically, so, or the most interesting ones. So.
That was excellent, Jim.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Really
Yes,
enjoyed that. I think on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you for showing us some interesting games, but it's also evident you put a lot of effort into preparing that session. And we thank you for your time and effort to do that. It's been really, really good.
Yeah.
I'm just relieved I managed to get the IT to work. And nice to do one of these, having done all these live lessons where the kids are all muted and you can't see them. It's quite nice to actually do one where it's interactive and you actually get a bit of feedback and so on as well, rather than just talking to a computer screen for an hour, you know. So, okay, thanks very much for having me. So,
Thanks. Very good.
Really good.